The cabin's been in my family since 1962. My grandfather built it himself, hauled the cedar logs in by mule team because there wasn't a road yet, just a fire trail that the Forest Service grading crew widened out about 10 years later. It sits on 40 acres of private inholding, inside what's now the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota, about 11 miles southwest of a town called Ely. If you know that country, you know what I mean when I say there's nothing out there. If you don't, just picture the deepest, oldest pine and birch forest you can imagine. Lake water so cold in June, it'll seize your chest if you fall in, and silence the size of a cathedral. That's where the cabin is. That's where this started. I should say up front that I'm not a guy who's into any of this stuff. I work for a road construction company out of Duluth. I run a paver. I drink Folgers because I don't taste the difference between that and the expensive stuff. The most spiritual experience I'd ever had before any of this was a deer rifle group at 200 yards that I couldn't explain because I'd been hung over when I shot it. So, when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, understand that nobody is more uncomfortable with this story than me. I'd rather be telling you about asphalt temperatures. But here we are. My name's Cal. I'm 46. My dad, my uncle, and I are the 3 legal owners of the cabin since my grandfather passed in 1991. We rotate who uses it when. Memorial Day through the second week of June is mine because that's when the walleye are running and my wife's mother visits, and I'd rather be eaten by bears than spend a week in a 1-bathroom house with that woman. I've been doing the same Memorial Day trip every year for 22 years. Same drive up Highway 1 from 2 Harbors. Same stop at the gas station in Finland for a sandwich and a 6-pack of hams. Same turn off onto the Forest Service road that takes you into the property. 22 years. I know that road the way you know the route to your own bathroom in the middle of the night. I could drive it blind. I'm telling you that because what I'm about to tell you didn't happen to a guy who was looking for it. It happened to a guy who has been driving past the same trees and the same boulders and the same culvert for 2 decades. And who would know if any of them moved? This started in 2019. That's 6 years ago now. I'd come up the Friday before Memorial Day, got in around 8 at night, unloaded the truck, did the usual. Turned the water on at the wellhead, checked the propane, lit the pilot on the fridge, swept out the mouse droppings on the kitchen floor because something always gets in over the winter no matter what you do. Then I sat on the porch and drank a beer and watched the lake. The thing about that cabin is that the porch faces northwest, and the property runs about 300 yards back from the water into the trees. There's a clearing maybe 60 feet wide between the cabin and the woodline. My grandfather kept it mowed because he was paranoid about wolves coming up on the dog he used to have, a German shepherd named Rusty. After Rusty died in '78, nobody had a dog at the cabin anymore, but my grandfather kept mowing the clearing anyway out of habit. After he passed, my dad kept doing it, and now I do it. You bush hog it once in May, and it stays low enough all summer. So I'm sitting on the porch that Friday night in 2019. The light is doing that thing it does up there in late May, where it doesn't really get dark until after 10, just goes blue and then bluer and then finally black. I'm looking out at the clearing, and I see something on the far edge near the woodline, a pile of something. I figured it was branches. We had a storm come through in April. That's what my uncle said when he was up there for opening day. I figured he'd drag some deadfall to the edge of the woods and didn't get around to burning it. I finished my beer. I went to bed. Saturday morning, I'm out there with my coffee, and I walk over to the pile to see how much work it is to deal with. It's not branches, it's bones. Now, bones in the woods, that's not, you find bones. You find deer bones, you find moose bones, you find old bear skulls if you're lucky and you know what to look for. The forest is full of bones. That's not the part that bothered me. The part that bothered me was that they were stacked, not in a heap, like an animal dragged a carcass there. Stacked. Long bones laid parallel to each other, in 2 layers crossing at right angles, the way you'd lay kindling for a fire. The vertebrae, I counted 12 of them, were arranged in a row next to the long bones, all facing the same direction, smallest to largest. And on top of the whole arrangement was a skull, a white-tailed deer, female, no antlers. The skull was set on top, jawbone tucked underneath it, eye sockets pointed at the cabin. I stood there for a long time. I want to be honest about that. I stood there for what felt like 15 minutes, but was probably 4 because my coffee got cold. And the whole time, I'm running through the explanations in my head. Hunter, Maybe somebody got onto the property in deer season, butchered out a doe, left the leftovers. But hunters don't stack bones. They drag the gut pile away from where they're going to drive out. They don't arrange anything. Kids. We get the occasional teenager who finds the cabin in the off-season, breaks in, drinks beers, leaves trash. We had that happen twice in the 90s. But kids don't stack bones either. Kids spray paint and throw rocks through windows. I came up with maybe 6 other explanations standing there in the wet grass, and none of them fit. The stack was deliberate. Somebody made it. And the only somebody who'd been on that property in the last 6 months was my uncle for opening day. And my uncle is 68 years old and would no sooner stack deer bones into a sculpture than he'd dance ballet. I dismantled it. I'm telling you this because I want you to know I tried to make it go away. I picked up each bone and I carried them by armful into the woods and scattered them in different directions. I took the skull and threw it as far as I could into the brush. Then I came back to the cabin and I made myself another cup of coffee, and I sat on the porch and I told myself, somebody is messing with you. Probably some idiot who's been camping on the lake and found the property and thought it'd be funny. And I let it go. Sunday morning, same spot, same stack, same bones. I want you to understand what that means. I had thrown those bones in 6 different directions. The skull alone went about 40 yards into thick brush. Somebody had gone and collected every single piece I'd scattered and put them back into the exact same arrangement. Same order, skull on top. Eye sockets pointed at the cabin. I'm not a guy who scares easy, but I'll tell you, my hands shook when I poured my coffee that morning, because the implication is that whoever did this knew I'd be coming back out to look at it. They knew I'd dismantled it the day before. They wanted me to see that they'd put it back. That's not somebody messing with you. That's a message. I called my dad on the cabin phone, which is a landline because cell service ends about 3 miles before you get to the property. My dad picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him what I was looking at. I told him exactly what I just told you, the stack, the skull, the eye sockets. There was a long silence on his end. Then he said, "Cal, listen to me. Has anything else been disturbed?" I said, "What do you mean, disturbed?" He said, "On the cabin, around the cabin, door, windows, the porch, anything moved or scratched or marked." I said, "I haven't looked." He said, "Look, then call me back." So I went and I looked. And I found 3 things I hadn't noticed. The first was on the porch step, the bottom one. There was a paw print pressed into the dirt at the base of the step. Just one. Big. I put my hand next to it to compare. My hand is not small. I wear a large glove, and the print was wider than my hand and longer by about 1.5 inches. 4 toes with claw marks at the front, pad in the back. It looked like a dog print, except for the size. The second thing was on the porch post. 6 feet up, head height. For me standing on the porch, there were 4 parallel grooves scratched into the cedar. Each one was about 6 inches long. They went deep, deeper than a bear claw, which I've seen plenty of times on trees up there. Cleaner edges, like the claws that made them, were sharper, harder. The third thing was the worst. On the cabin's back door, the door that nobody uses because it opens onto the woodshed, and you have to walk around the cabin to get to it, there was a smear, about waist high. It looked like somebody had pressed their hand against the door, except it wasn't a hand. It was wider than a hand, and the fingers were too long, and there were only 4 of them. And the smear was reddish-brown and slightly wet, still in the cool morning air. I went back inside, and I called my dad. I told him about the print and the scratches and the smear. He was quiet again. Then he said something that I've thought about every single day since. He said, "It came back." I said, "What came back? Dad, what are you talking about?" He said, "Your grandfather had something out there. We never talked about it. He didn't want us to. But it came around the cabin for a long time when I was a kid. Big animal. He fed it. He left things out for it. He said it kept the wolves off the property." I said, "Dad, what kind of animal?" He said, "He never told us. He wouldn't say. He just called it the visitor." I want to be clear here. My father is not a guy who tells campfire stories. My father is a retired insurance adjuster who reads Tom Clancy novels and votes Republican and thinks the most exciting thing in the world is a well-organized garage. For him to say what he just said, in the tone he said it, was like the floor of my life shifting 1/2 inch sideways. Nothing had moved, but everything was different. I asked him what to do. He said, "Leave it food. That's what Pa did. Leave it food at the edge of the clearing and don't watch it eat. Don't ever watch it eat. He was very clear about that. I said, "What kind of food?" He said, "Meat, anything raw." He used to leave the trimmings from butchering, the heads and the offal. "If you don't have that, leave it some of your dinner." I said, "Dad, are you hearing yourself right now?" He said, "Cal, I know how it sounds, but the bones, the prints, the smear, that's it. That's what your grandfather described to me when I was 12 years old, and he sat me down on this same porch and told me. He said, if it ever came back, leave it food and don't watch it eat." He said it wouldn't bother me. We hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went to the cooler and I got out the package of pork chops I'd bought at the gas station. 3 of them. I unwrapped them and I carried them out to the edge of the clearing near where the stack had been, and I set them on a flat rock. Then I went back to the cabin and I closed the curtains on every window and I didn't look out for the rest of the night. In the morning, the pork chops were gone. The rock was clean. No fur, no blood, nothing to suggest that an animal had been there. The stack of bones was also gone. The bones I'd thrown into the woods the day before, and the new ones that had been restacked, all of them, gone. The clearing was just grass. I packed up and drove home a day early. I told my wife I was tired. I didn't tell her any of this. I didn't tell her any of this for 4 years. The next year, 2020, I almost didn't go. I'd been thinking about it all winter. By April, I'd half convinced myself it had been a prank, that I had been spooked by my dad's reaction more than the bones themselves, and that if I went back, everything would be normal. The other half of me knew it wouldn't be. I went. I got there on a Friday, same routine, and there was nothing in the clearing. No stack, no prints, no smear on the back door. I checked. I walked the whole property line. I checked the woodshed. I checked the dock. I checked the spot where I'd left the pork chops. Nothing. Clean as you please. So I told myself, okay, it really was a prank. It was kids. It was a weird hunter. It was anything but what my dad had said. And I had a great week. I caught fish. I read a paperback by the dock. I drank my hams. I drove home rested and feeling stupid for ever having been scared. That was a Saturday. The following Tuesday, my dad called me. He'd just gotten off the phone with my uncle. My uncle had gone up to the cabin on Sunday after I left to do some maintenance on the dock. He'd found a stack at the edge of the clearing, not deer bones this time. A wolf, skull intact, long bones stacked, vertebrae in a row. My uncle, who is not a man who scares either, packed up and drove home that same afternoon. He told my dad, and I quote because my dad repeated it to me twice, "That's the last time I'm going up there alone in May." I asked my dad what he thought it meant. "The wolf," my dad said. "Pa always said it kept the wolves off the property." So, that was 2020. After that, I started keeping a journal, not for anybody else, just for me, because I knew that what was happening was outside the part of life that I trusted my memory for, and I needed it written down so that years later, when I tried to convince myself it hadn't happened, I'd have the proof in my own handwriting. 2021, Memorial Day weekend. I arrived to find nothing in the clearing but on the porch step, that same paw print pressed into the dirt, just one, same size as before, same orientation, pointing toward the door. I stood there with my duffel bag in my hand and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I called my dad. He said, "Leave food," same as before. I left a pound of ground beef on the rock at the edge of the clearing. In the morning, it was gone. The paw print was still there. I went out and put my hand next to it again, the way I had 2 years before. And I noticed something I hadn't noticed the first time. There was a 5th mark behind the pad, a separate impression, smaller, like a dew claw, but the way it was set, the angle of it, didn't match any dog's foot I'd ever seen. It was lower on the print, like the back of a heel, like the animal walked on the back of its foot the way a person does, not on its toes the way a dog does. I sat on the porch with that print in front of me for most of an afternoon. The cabin makes you do that. It makes you sit with things. There's no TV up there. The radio gets one AM station out of Duluth that fades in and out depending on the weather. There's no internet. You sit with what's in front of you, and what was in front of me was the shape of a foot that did not match any animal I had ever heard of, and the slow realization that my grandfather had spent 30 years sitting on this same porch, looking at this same kind of print, and had never told a single person about it. I want to say something here about my grandfather, because the more this went on, the more I started to feel like I was getting to know a version of him I had never met. The grandfather I remembered was a quiet man. He had been a machinist at a tool and dye shop in Hibbing for 31 years before he retired. He smoked a pipe. He could fix any small engine ever built. He used to make me pancakes on Saturday mornings in the cabin kitchen, the kind with a face of blueberries on top. He never raised his voice. He never told stories. He was not a mystical man. He was not a fanciful man. He was the most ordinary, decent, practical man I had ever known. And he had spent 30 years feeding a creature in the woods. He had carried that knowledge in his chest alongside the grocery list and the truck repair calendar and whatever else he carried, and he had never let it show. I don't know how a person does that. I don't know how you sit at a kitchen table with your son and your grandson and eat pancakes and know that there is a 7-foot creature in the woods outside that you have been feeding since before the boy was born and that you will never tell either of them about. I think about that a lot. The discipline of it, the loneliness of it. That weekend I drove down to Ely on the Saturday to get groceries, and I stopped at the small historical society they have on Sheridan Street. It's a one-room place in an old bank building, run by a volunteer named Marlene, who looks like a retired school teacher because she is one. I asked her, as casually as I could, if she knew anything about the family that had owned my property before my grandfather bought it. She said yes, she did. The land had been a piece of the original Vermilion Iron Range allotment, set aside as in holding when the federal land got reorganized in the 1940s. And before that, it had been Ojibwe land going back further than anybody on paper could trace. She said my grandfather had bought it from a man named Henrik Lindgren, a Finnish trapper, in 1960. Lindgren had only owned it for about 6 years. Before Lindgren, it had belonged to a family with a long Ojibwe name that Marlene wrote down for me, but I won't try to pronounce, who had held it as registered tribal land going back into the 1800s. I asked her if Lindgren had built anything on the property. She said no. He had owned the land but never lived on it. He had a small trapping cabin further south on Burnside Lake. The 40 acres my grandfather bought had been empty when he bought it, empty of buildings anyway. My grandfather had built the cabin himself in 1962, 2 years after buying the land. I asked Marlene if she knew why Lindgren had sold. She said she didn't know for sure, but she had heard, from a long-dead cousin of Lindgren's who had once come into the historical society, that the trapper had bought the land planning to build a hunting lodge on it and had changed his mind after one winter spent walking the property. She said the cousin had used a Finnish word for it that translated more or less as the wrong woods. She said Lindgren had told the cousin that the property was good country to look at, but bad country to stay in, and that he had sold it at a loss to the first buyer who came along, which had turned out to be my grandfather. I thanked Marlene, and I bought a postcard I didn't need, and I drove back to the cabin, and I sat on the porch, and I thought about that for a long time. Lindgren had walked the property in winter, when the leaves were down, and the snow showed everything, and he had decided he could not live there. My grandfather had bought it from him 2 years later, and stayed for 30 years. Either my grandfather was less observant than the trapper, which I knew was not true, or my grandfather had walked the same property and seen the same things and decided that he could live there anyway. Either he hadn't known what he was buying, or he had known and had said yes to it. I want to be careful with my words here, because I know how this sounds. I'm not telling you I figured anything out that weekend. I'm telling you I noticed a detail that didn't fit, and I wrote it down in the journal, and I went home and didn't think about it for a year. But the journal was getting thicker now. There were sketches in it of the paw print. There was the Ojibwe family name Marlene had written down. There was Lindgren's name and the Finnish phrase. The story was getting bigger around me even when I wasn't looking at it. 2022. This was the year I started to understand what I was dealing with, or to understand that I would never understand it, which is its own kind of understanding. I got to the cabin on the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. There was nothing in the clearing. There was nothing on the porch. The back door was clean. I walked the property line. Clean. I thought, okay, maybe it's over. Maybe whatever this was, it's moved on. Saturday night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up because something was on the porch. The cabin has a wood floor, and the porch is wood, and they're connected, so anything walking on the porch you feel in the floorboards of the cabin. I lay in bed, and I felt the slow, steady weight of something moving across the porch toward the front door. Heavy steps. I counted 4 of them. Then a pause. Then a sound that I cannot describe except by approximation. Imagine a dog sniffing at the bottom of a door, the way a dog does when it knows somebody's on the other side. Rapid, shallow inhales through a wet nose. Now, imagine that sound, but louder, much louder, loud enough that you can hear it through a closed door from across a room. Loud enough that you can feel the air moving when it inhales because the gap under the door is sucking air toward whatever is on the other side of it. I lay in bed. I didn't move. I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't move because I couldn't. My body had gone into a kind of paralysis that I've only ever read about in articles about sleep apnea. My hands wouldn't respond. My legs wouldn't respond. I lay there and I listened to it sniff at the door for what my watch later told me was 11 minutes. Then it stopped. I heard the floorboards creak as it shifted its weight. And then I heard a sound that I have replayed in my head every night since because it is the second most wrong sound I have ever heard in my life. The first being something else I'll tell you about later. It made a sound that was almost a word, just one syllable. Low, breathy, the way somebody trying to speak through a mouthful of water might sound. It said, "Care." The first syllable of my name, Cal. It said, the start of my name. Then the weight moved away from the door, and I heard 4 more steps across the porch, and then it was gone. I lay in bed until the sun came up. I did not move. I did not check the door. I did not look out the window. When the light was full and the birds were going, I got up and I put on my boots and I walked out to the front door and I opened it. There was a stack on the porch, right in front of the door where it had been sniffing. Small this time, just 3 things. A vertebra, a piece of a long bone, and on top, a single tooth. A canine tooth, about 1.5 inches long, gleaming white, with a small crack running down one side that had been filled in with something dark, like the tooth had been broken once and then healed. I did not pick it up. I left it there. I packed my things into the truck and I drove the 11 miles back to the Forest Service Road, and I called my dad from the gas station in Finland. I told him about the sound, the voice, the almost word. There was a very long silence on his end. Then he said, "Cal, I have to tell you something I didn't tell you before. I didn't tell you because I didn't believe it, and because Pa made me promise not to." He told me that one night when he was a kid, maybe 10 or 11, he'd snuck out of bed and gone to the window because he heard the visitor on the porch. He'd looked out. He'd seen it. He didn't describe it in detail, even now, even when I asked. He said, "It was tall, Cal. It was tall and it was on 2 legs, and it had a long face like a dog, and it was looking right back at me through the window because it had heard me move. And it said my name. Pa's name. Roy. It said Roy. Then it walked off the porch and into the woods, and I never saw it again." He said, "Pa came in the next morning, and I told him. I was crying. He sat me down at the kitchen table and he said, 'Son, the visitor is old. It was here before us. It knows our names because it's been listening for a long, long time. It won't hurt us. But you don't watch it. You don't speak to it. You don't try to know it. You leave it food and you let it be.'" I asked my dad why he'd never told me this. He said, "Because Pa told me not to. He said the more you talk about it, the more it pays attention. And I figured if I never said anything, it'd forget about us." I said, "Dad, why is it back?" He said, "I don't know, Cal. Maybe it never left. I went home. I told my wife everything. I had to tell somebody. And she's the only person on earth who I can tell something like this and have her sit there and listen and not laugh." She didn't laugh. She got very quiet, and then she said, "Cal, are you going to keep going up there?" I said I didn't know. She said, "I think you should." I asked her why. She said, "Because your dad's right. It was your grandfather's cabin, and your dad knew about it, and now you know about it. That makes it yours to deal with. If you stop going, somebody else will buy that property eventually, and they won't know, and they won't leave food, and whatever it is will come down on them in a way it didn't come down on you." I love my wife. I want to put that on the record. She is smarter than I am, and she is braver than I am, and she said the thing I'd been thinking but couldn't put into words. I went back the next year, 2023. I went with a plan. I'd spent the winter reading. I won't lie to you about what I read. I read a lot of stuff, some of it serious and some of it not, and I found things in places I wouldn't have looked before. Native accounts from the Ojibwe people, who've lived in that country for centuries, talk about a creature they sometimes describe as a dog-headed walker, A thing that stands on two legs and is taller than a man and has a face like a wolf or a coyote. They don't talk about it loud or often. The accounts I found were from people who'd written things down a long time ago, mostly settlers and missionaries who had heard the stories secondhand. The stories say the creature is old, older than people. The stories say it can be a guardian if you treat it right and a predator if you don't. I also found stuff from a lot further away, which is the part that I keep coming back to. There's a section of the Book of Enoch, which is an old Jewish text from around the 2nd or 3rd century BC, that describes the Watchers, angels who came down to earth and took human wives and produced children that were not human, that were hybrid things, giants, Nephilim. And in a later section, when those hybrids die, their spirits become what the text calls evil spirits that walk on the earth and dwell in the wilderness. The text describes them as having the appearance of beasts, but the cunning of men. The text says they remember names. The text says they accept offerings. I'm not religious. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not telling you any of this because I believe it in a religious sense. I'm telling you because I read the description written down 2,000 years ago in a country I've never been to, by people who could not possibly have known about a cabin in northern Minnesota. And the description matched what was on my porch, the same body type, the same long dog-like face, the same intelligence, the same habit of accepting offerings of meat, the same recognition of human names. 2,000 years apart. Different continents, different cultures, different languages, same thing. I don't know what to do with that. I really don't. I'm a road construction guy. But I read it and I thought, okay, there's something here, and it's been here a lot longer than my family has. And the rules my grandfather followed were rules other people had figured out a long time before him in other places. Leave food. Don't watch it eat. Don't speak to it. Don't try to know it. I went up to the cabin in 2023 with a cooler full of meat. I'd stopped at a butcher on the way and bought beef trimmings, the cheap stuff, the kind they sell to people who feed it to their dogs. About 15 pounds of it. I put it in the cooler with ice. When I got to the cabin, I left a single pork chop on the rock at the edge of the clearing. I went inside. I closed the curtains. I waited. In the morning, the pork chop was gone. There was no stack. There was no print on the step. There was no smear on the back door. The clearing was clean. I left another offering the next night. This time about 2 pounds of the beef trimmings. Same result. Gone in the morning, no trace. I stayed for 10 days. I left food every night. Every morning it was gone, and there was never any disturbance. No stack, no print, no scratches. I started to relax. I started to feel like I had figured something out, like I had earned a kind of understanding with the thing. On my last night, I did something that I now think was the stupidest thing I've ever done. I sat on the porch after dark with the lights off, and I left a piece of bacon on the porch railing, and I sat in my chair about 10 feet from it, and I waited. I want to be clear about why. I wasn't trying to see it. I wasn't trying to break the rule. I had told myself a story that I was going to sit there in case it needed something else, in case I could give it more, in case there was some way to be useful beyond just leaving meat on a rock. That's what I told myself. The truth is I wanted to see it. I'm a man. I'm 46 years old. I'm not made of stone, and I had been thinking about this thing for 4 years, and I wanted to see it. I sat there for about an hour. Then I heard the floorboards of the porch creak. I'm going to tell you something now that I have not told my wife, and I have not told my dad, and I have not told anybody until right now. The thing came up onto the porch from the side, from the direction of the woodshed, where there are no stairs, and the porch is about 3 feet off the ground. I heard it lift itself up onto the porch in one motion. Not climb, not jump, lift. The way a man would put his hands on a railing and swing his legs up over it, except in one fluid motion with no sound, except the wood compressing under sudden weight. It came around the corner of the cabin. The porch has an L shape, and I was sitting in the long part of the L, and it came around the corner of the short part. I could not see it directly. I could see the corner of the porch. I could see a shadow at the edge of my peripheral vision that wasn't right. I want you to understand, I had not turned my head. I had not looked at it. I was looking straight ahead at the trees, but my peripheral vision was picking up the shadow at the corner, and the shadow was tall. The top of the shadow was above the roof line of the porch. The porch roof is 7.5 feet high. The thing standing at the corner of my porch was taller than 7.5 feet. It did not move. I did not move. We sat there in the dark for, I don't know how long. My brain wasn't tracking time the way it normally does, but later when I looked at my watch, it had been 34 minutes. 34 minutes of sitting in a chair on a porch with something 7.5 feet tall standing at the corner of my house, just out of my direct line of sight, neither of us moving. After 34 minutes, it spoke. It said, K-ow. 2 syllables this time. My whole name. Slow, breathy, but clearer than the first time. Like it had been practicing. I did not move. I did not turn my head. I did not respond. It said, Roy. My grandfather's name. The name my father had said it had said to him 50 years ago, looking through a window. I closed my eyes. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. I closed my eyes and I sat there with tears running down my face. Because that thing remembered my grandfather. My grandfather had been dead for 32 years, and that thing standing at the corner of my porch in the dark remembered him by name and was saying his name out loud to me, the grandson, in the same place where my grandfather had once stood and fed it. It said one more thing. It said a word I didn't recognize. It was longer than my name. It had 3 or 4 syllables, and the consonants were soft and the vowels were drawn out. It sounded almost like a question. The way you'd say somebody's name when you were calling them in from outside. Later, when I drove home, I called my dad from the gas station and I asked him if my grandfather had ever mentioned anything else. Anything besides the visitor, a word, a name. My dad was quiet for a long time, and then he said, Pa used to say something when he left the food out. He'd whisper a word over the meat before he set it down. He told me one time it was the visitor's name. He said it had told him once. I don't remember how to say it. I never could say it right. I asked my dad to try. He tried. He couldn't quite get it. But the syllables he stumbled through were close to what I had heard on the porch. Close enough. The thing standing at the corner of my porch had said its own name to me. Or it had said its name, and then my name, the way you'd introduce yourself. Or it had said its name, and then my grandfather's name, and then my name, the way a parent would point to family members and say, This is who we are, this is the line, this is your place in it. I don't know which, I don't think I'll ever know which. But that was the last thing it said before I heard its weight lift off the porch and move away into the dark. I sat there until dawn. The piece of bacon on the railing was gone. The chair I was sitting in was wet with sweat through the back, even though the night had been cold. What happened this spring is what made me start telling people, made me sit down and start writing it out, made me decide that whatever rule my grandfather had set up about silence, that rule wasn't going to cover this, because this is bigger than the rule was meant for. What happened this year is not the part where I find an explanation. It's the part where the explanation gets bigger. This spring, 2025, Memorial Day weekend, 2 weeks ago. I drove up on Friday like always, stopped at the gas station in Finland, bought my sandwich and my 6-pack and this year, a cooler full of meat. 20 pounds of beef trimmings from the butcher in 2 harbors. I'd worked out a routine over the previous 2 springs. Leave food every night. Don't sit on the porch after dark. Don't speak. Don't watch. I pulled into the property around 8 at night. The sun was still up because of how late it gets dark up there in May. I unloaded the truck, I turned the water on, I lit the pilot on the fridge, I did all the normal things. Then I walked out to the clearing. There was a stack at the edge of the trees, a big one, bigger than any I'd seen before. I want to describe it for you carefully because the details matter. The base of the stack was made of long bones, deer femurs, and tibias, laid parallel in 3 layers crossing at right angles. About 20 bones in the base. On top of the base was a row of vertebrae, 18 of them, smallest to largest, all facing the same direction. On top of the vertebrae were ribs, arranged in a kind of fan shape, spreading outward like the spokes of a wheel. And on top of the ribs, in the center, was a human skull. I want to say that again. On top of the stack was a human skull. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a forensic guy, but you know a human skull when you see one. The proportions are different from any animal. The eye sockets face forward, set close together. The brain case is huge compared to the jaw. The jaw was there, set underneath the skull, like the deer skulls had been in the previous stacks. The teeth were intact. It was an adult skull. Whoever it had been was full grown. It was old. That was the other thing. It wasn't a fresh skull. The bone was discolored, yellowed, the way bone gets after it's been in the ground for a long time. Some of the surface had that chalky, weathered look that bones get when they've been exposed to sun and rain for years. This wasn't somebody who just died. This was somebody who'd been dead for a long, long time. I stood there. I stood there for I don't know how long. My brain was doing this thing where it kept trying to make the skull be something else. A bear skull seen from a weird angle. A monkey skull, even though there are no monkeys in Minnesota. Anything but what it was. I walked back to the cabin. I went inside. I locked the doors, which I hadn't done in 22 years of going up there. I called my dad. My dad listened. When I finished, he said, "Cal, you need to leave, right now. Pack up and leave." I said, "Dad, what is this?" He said, "I don't know, Cal, I don't know. But Pa never had anything like this. The visitor never brought him a human anything. It brought him deer. It brought him wolves. It never brought him a person. This is something new." I said, "Dad, where would it even get a human skull? Out here?" He said, "There's old burials all over that country. Some of them are Ojibwe. Some of them are older than that. There's been people in those woods for thousands of years. There's bones in the ground everywhere if you know where to look. And it knows where to look, Cal. It has been there longer than any of us." I said, "Dad, why is it bringing me this?" And my dad said, "The thing that I think about every night now." He said, "Cal, I don't think it's bringing you anything. I think it's showing you something. I think it's been here for a long time. And it's been watching us and it's been keeping things, and now it's letting you see what it has. Because something is changing, either with it or with us or with both." I asked him what I should do. He said, "Get in the truck and drive home." I didn't. I want to tell you why I didn't. And I want to be honest about it. Because the easy version is that I stayed because I was brave. That's not true. I stayed because I was confused. I sat in the cabin with the doors locked, and I tried to think about what my grandfather would have done, and I couldn't decide. My grandfather had a deal with this thing. The deal was simple. Meat for protection, wolves stayed away, the cabin was safe. The deal had worked for 63 years. And now the thing was bringing me a human skull, and I didn't know what that meant in the terms of the deal. Was it a threat? Was it a gift? Was it a warning? Was it the thing showing me what it could do if I broke the rules? I sat in the kitchen and I drank a beer and I thought about it for 2 hours, and then I made a decision that I want to walk you through carefully because it matters for what happens next. I decided that I was going to leave it food, the way I always did, but more than usual. All 20 pounds of the beef trimmings, all at once. As a kind of statement, as a way of saying, I see what you brought me, and I'm still keeping up my end. I put the meat in a big metal feed bucket. I carried it out to the clearing. I set it down on the rock about 10 feet away from the stack with the human skull on top. I did not look at the skull. I kept my eyes on the rock. I walked back to the cabin. I closed the door. I locked it. I closed the curtains. I went to bed. I did not sleep. I lay in bed and I listened. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it on the porch. I want you to picture this. I'm in the bedroom. The bedroom door is closed. The bedroom door opens into the main room of the cabin. The main room has the front door, which opens onto the porch, so there are 2 closed doors between me and whatever is outside, and I heard it. The weight on the floorboards, slow, heavy steps, 4 of them, then a pause, then the sniffing. Loud, wet, rapid inhales right at the base of the front door, the same sniffing I'd heard 3 years before. It went on for about 3 minutes, then it spoke. It said my name. Cal, clear, almost like a person. The voice was deep, the way a big dog's bark is deep, but shaped, like it was forcing the shape of human speech out of a throat that was not built for it. It said, Cal, come out. I want you to understand, in 4 years, the thing had said my name twice, and my grandfather's name once, and its own name once. That's it. 4 words, 4 syllables total, spread across 2 separate visits. It had never said a sentence. It had never put words together. And now, on the 3rd visit, it was talking to me. It was telling me to come out. I did not respond. I did not move. I lay in bed, and I closed my eyes, and I tried to do the breathing exercise my wife taught me when I was having a hard time at work. In and out through the nose. Count of 4, count of 4, count of 4. I tried to make my body so still that it wouldn't notice me through the wood. It said, Cal, come out. I have to show you. The breathing exercise was not working. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could feel my hands shaking. I could feel the air in the room moving very slightly because the front door, which had a quarter-inch gap at the bottom, was being breathed on from the other side, and the air pressure in the cabin was shifting with each inhale and exhale. I want to be very clear about my reasoning at this point, because it's important. I had spent 4 years convinced that the thing was a kind of arrangement, a treaty. My grandfather had set it up. My family had maintained it. I had upheld it. And now the thing was speaking to me directly, and it was telling me to come out. And the human skull was sitting on a stack at the edge of the clearing where it had put it for me to find. And I could not figure out whether what was happening was the deal being honored or the deal being broken. I decided to wait. I decided that if I didn't move, if I didn't respond, the thing would either go away or it would force the door. And either way, I would have an answer. It did not force the door. It said my name 3 more times, spaced about a minute apart. Each time it sounded clearer than the last. Each time it said, "Come out, I have to show you." After the 3rd time, I heard its weight move off the porch. I heard 4 steps across the yard, then nothing. I lay there for the rest of the night. I did not sleep. When the sun came up, I went to the front door and I opened it. The bucket of meat was gone. The metal bucket itself was gone. I never found it. The stack of bones with the human skull was gone. Every piece of it. The clearing was completely clean. But on the porch, right in front of the door, was a single object, set down carefully, placed. It was a leather glove, a work glove, brown leather, well-worn, the kind of glove you'd use for splitting wood or handling fence wire. The cuff of the glove was stained dark, the way leather gets stained when it's been wet and dried over and over. I recognized it. I recognized it immediately because I had seen its pair my whole life. The other glove, the right-hand glove, was hanging on a nail inside the woodshed, where my grandfather had hung it the last time he used it, before he died in 1991. The thing on the porch was the left-hand glove, my grandfather's left-hand glove, the one that had gone missing the same week he died, the one my father and my uncle and I had looked for 2 summers in a row, because the right one was hanging there alone, and it bothered us. We had assumed it was lost. It had not been lost. The visitor had it. The visitor had been keeping it for 34 years. I picked the glove up. The leather was soft. The stains on the cuff smelled faintly of mud and something else, something old, like the inside of a cellar that nobody has opened in a long time. I held it in my hand and I looked out at the clearing where the stack had been, and I understood, finally, what my dad had said on the phone. The thing wasn't bringing me anything. It was showing me what it had. Bones in the woods, bones from a deer, bones from a wolf, bones from a person who died, who knows how long ago, whose grave the visitor knew about and visited, and a glove that had belonged to my grandfather, a man who had fed this thing for almost 30 years, and who, when he died, had apparently been visited one last time by something that had taken a piece of him to remember him by. I sat on the porch in the morning light, and I held my grandfather's glove, and I cried for a while. I don't know what I was crying about exactly, partly because I was relieved that I was still alive, partly because I was scared in a way I'd never been scared before, partly because I was understanding for the first time that the thing in the woods was not an animal and was not a monster, but was something else, something with a memory, something that kept things to remember the dead by, something that had loved my grandfather in whatever way a thing like that loves. After a while I went inside. I put the glove on the kitchen table. I sat down in the kitchen and I tried to think. I had to decide what to do. The thing had told me to come out. It had said it had to show me. I had not gone out. The deal might have been broken on my end. The fact that it had left a peaceful gift and walked away suggested it might not have been. But I didn't know. I called my dad. I told him about the glove. I told him about the voice. I told him everything. My dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Cal, I have to come up there." I said, "Dad, you're 73 years old. You haven't been to the cabin in 8 years. He said, "I know, but you can't be there alone for this." And the visitor knew Pa. The visitor knew me, even if it never showed itself to me again after that one time. It'll know me when I come back. We can do this together, you and me. I argued with him. He won. He always wins. He drove up the next day. It took him 11 hours because he stops every 90 minutes to walk around. He pulled into the property on Sunday afternoon. We hugged on the porch, which we never do, and then we went inside, and I showed him the glove, and he held it for a long time and said, "That's his. That's Pa's glove. I remember it." That night, we sat on the porch together for a couple hours before sundown, drinking beers, not talking much. My dad looked older than I remembered. His hands were spotted. He'd lost weight, but he sat in my grandfather's old chair, the one nobody sits in. And he looked out at the clearing the way my grandfather used to look at it, like he was watching for something specific. Around dusk, he said, "Cal, I want you to know something. When I was a kid, after the night I saw it through the window, Pa told me that the visitor wasn't dangerous to us. He said it was bound by something, by a kind of agreement, that as long as we kept up our end, it would keep up its. He said the agreement went back to my grandmother's people, the Ojibwe side of the family. He said her grandfather had made the original deal, generations ago, before there was a cabin here, before there was a road, before any of it. He said our family had been part of this arrangement for a long, long time, and that I would carry it, and you would carry it, and your kids would carry it if you ever had any, which you don't. So I guess it stops with you." I had not known any of that. My grandmother had died when I was 4. I knew she was part Ojibwe. I did not know that her family had a deal with anything in the woods. My dad said, "Pa told me one other thing. He said that the visitor was here to keep something away. He didn't say what. He just said that as long as the visitor was on the property was safe. And he said that someday the visitor would either move on or it would die. And when that happened, whatever it was keeping away would come. And we would have to decide what to do." I asked him what he thought it was keeping away. He said, "I don't know, Cal. I never asked. I was a kid. I was scared. I just took his word for it." We sat there until full dark. Then we went inside. That night, the third night I'd been at the cabin in 2025, the second night for my dad, the visitor came back. I heard it on the porch around 2 a.m, the same 4 heavy steps, the same pause. But this time, before the sniffing started, it spoke. It said, "Roy." I felt my dad sit up in the other bed. We were sharing the bedroom because my dad couldn't make it up the ladder to the loft. I heard him swing his feet onto the floor. I heard him stand up. I said very quietly, "Dad, don't." He didn't answer me. He walked across the bedroom in his socks. He opened the bedroom door. He walked into the main room. I followed him, my heart hammering, but I followed him because what else was I going to do? My dad walked up to the front door. The thing on the other side of it was breathing slowly. The whole cabin was vibrating slightly with each breath. My dad put his hand on the door handle. I said, "Dad." He said, "It's okay, Cal." It said my name. He opened the door. I want to tell you what I saw because this is the part I have not been able to stop seeing, awake or asleep, for 2 weeks now. It was standing in the yard about 15 feet from the porch. It was not on the porch anymore. It had backed up to give us room. It was, as best I can describe, a little over 7 feet tall, maybe 7.5. Its body was covered in dark fur, almost black, with patches of gray around the chest and throat that suggested age. Its proportions were the proportions my dad had described in the Book of Enoch passages, long-limbed, narrow-chested, but powerful, the muscles in its arms and legs visible even through the fur. Its hands had 5 fingers, with curved black claws at the tips. Its feet, I could see the back of one foot turned slightly toward me, were long, plantigrade, the way a human foot is, walking on the heel. Its face was the face of a wolf, but longer. The muzzle was elongated, and the proportions of the head were wrong for any wolf. The skull too high, the brain case too large. Its ears were back, lying flat against its head. Its eyes were the worst part. They reflected the light from the cabin in a way that animal eyes do, a bright greenish-yellow shine. But the shape of the eye, the intelligence in the eye, was not animal. It looked at us the way you'd look at family members you hadn't seen in a long time. It looked at my dad. It said, "Roy." My dad stood on the porch. He did not move. He did not speak. He just stood there in his socks, in his pajama pants, in his old man's body, and he looked at the thing that had visited him through a window when he was a child, and that he had not seen for 62 years. It said, "Roy, he is leaving." I want to be honest, I almost did not understand the sentence at first. The voice was hard to follow. The shape of human speech in a non-human throat is hard to parse. But after a second, my brain caught up. "He is leaving," my dad said. "Who?" The visitor looked past my dad. It looked at me, and I felt that look go all the way through me, the way a doctor's stethoscope feels going through a thin shirt, like I was being examined. It said, I am leaving. I am old. I cannot keep watch. He must know. My dad started crying. He just stood there on the porch and tears started running down his face. I had not seen my dad cry since my grandfather's funeral. He said, "Where are you going?" The visitor said, "Down. I am going down." I did not understand that. I still don't understand it exactly. But the way it said the word down, I understood that it meant something specific, some place, some location, maybe a death, maybe a return, maybe somewhere it had come from a long time ago that it was going back to. It looked at me again. It said, "Cal, you must keep watch now." I said, "I don't know how." It said, "I will show you." It turned and it walked toward the wood line. Not the way an animal turns, the way a person turns, pivoting on one foot. It walked in a way that was almost human, with the slight lope of something whose anatomy was a compromise. But the gait, the rhythm of it, was the rhythm of a man walking, not a beast. When it got to the edge of the clearing, it stopped. It looked back at us. It made a sound, a low rumble in its chest, and then it lifted its head and it made a single sound that I'm going to try to describe, even though I know I'll fail. It was not a howl. It was a call, a summons. It rose and fell in a pattern I recognized, after a second, as a melody, a short musical phrase, 4 notes that climbed and then descended. It was beautiful in a way that I want to say wasn't right, that nothing out of that throat should sound that way, but it was right. It was right because it was a song, and the visitor was singing. The forest answered. I want to be careful here because this is the part that I think people will have the hardest time believing, and I understand if you stop listening at this point. But the forest answered. From deep in the trees, far back, way past the clearing, way past the property line, way past anything I'd ever explored, something answered the call. Not one voice, many. A chorus of low rumbling growls and short barking sounds, and 1 or 2 longer calls that rose and fell in the same musical pattern the visitor had used. There were others. There had always been others. The visitor had been one of them. The agreement my grandfather had made, the agreement his grandfather's grandfather had made, had been with one of a community of creatures that lived in the deep woods of northern Minnesota, that had been there for who knows how long, that had been keeping watch over something, and that were now, for whatever reason, calling our specific visitors home. The visitor looked back at us one more time. It said, "Cal, come." My dad looked at me. He said, "Cal, go, I'll stay here." I said, "Dad, I can't." He said, "You can. It's asking you. Go with it, just to the edge. Just see what it wants you to see." I stepped off the porch. My feet were bare. The ground was cold and wet with dew. I walked across the clearing toward the visitor. When I got within 10 feet of it, I stopped. I could smell it, finally. It smelled like a wet dog, and like deep earth, and like something else, something faintly sweet, like old fruit that had fallen and started to turn. It was not a bad smell. It was an old smell. It looked down at me. Its head was at a height where it had to look down. I am 6'1", and the top of its head was over 7 feet. Easy. Its yellow eyes were a little less than 2 feet above mine. It said, "Follow." It turned and walked into the woods. I followed it. I want to put on the record that I did this. I, Cal, 46 years old, road construction guy, paver operator, husband and son, walked barefoot into the deep dark woods of northern Minnesota at 3 in the morning following a creature that should not have existed. We walked for, I think, about 20 minutes. The visitor moved slowly to let me keep up. The forest was completely silent. Whatever had answered the call earlier had gone quiet. We walked along an old game trail that I had walked dozens of times in daylight, and it looked different at night with a 7-foot creature ahead of me. The trees seemed taller. The space between them seemed deeper. The visitor walked the trail like a man walks a familiar hallway in his own house in the dark. It did not slow down at the turns. It did not hesitate at the deadfall where the trail forks around an old white pine that came down in a windstorm maybe 15 years ago. It knew where it was going. It had walked this trail, I realized, more times than I had. It had probably walked it more times than my grandfather had. This was its country, and the trail was its trail, and I was the visitor here. I had been the visitor all along. The cabin was an outpost on its land, not the other way around. About halfway in, we passed a tree I knew. A big red pine with a lightning scar down one side. I had stood under that pine once with my grandfather when I was 7 years old. He had pointed up at the scar and told me how to tell which side of a tree had been hit by looking at which way the bark had blown out. I had not thought about that day in almost 40 years. I thought about it now, walking past the same tree in the dark with the visitor ahead of me, and I felt a kind of grief come up in my chest that I did not expect. Because my grandfather had walked this trail too, almost certainly. The trail led to the mound, and the mound was the whole reason for everything. And my grandfather would have known about the mound, and he would have walked here. Maybe with the visitor ahead of him, the same way it was ahead of me now. Maybe on the night before he died. I don't know, I will never know. But the thought of him on this same path, on a night I cannot remember, and that was kept from me on purpose, made my throat close up so hard I had to stop for a second. The visitor stopped too. It did not turn around. It just stopped, ahead of me on the trail, and waited. I caught my breath. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I kept walking. The visitor started moving again as soon as I did. After about 20 minutes, we came to a place I did not recognize. A small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, ringed by old birch trees. In the middle of the clearing was a low mound of earth, maybe 3 feet high, covered in moss and grass. The mound was rectangular. The proportions of it, the way it sat in the clearing, the careful symmetry of it, made it clear immediately that it was made by something, not a natural feature, a grave or a marker or a structure of some kind. The birches around the clearing were old. Birches don't usually live past 80 years, but these were past that. Some of them had the gray peeled look of trees that were on their last decade or two of life, with the upper branches already going skeletal. They formed a ring around the clearing that was too even to be accidental. Somebody had planted them. Somebody, a long time ago, maybe 150 years ago, maybe more, had planted a ring of birch trees around this clearing as a kind of marker, and the trees had grown and aged and were now starting to die, and somebody would need to plant the next ring soon, or there would be no marker at all. I wondered if that was part of the duty too, planting new birches when the old ones started to go. I wondered if my grandfather had ever planted one. I made a note in my head to check, the next time I walked the property in daylight, for any birches that looked younger than the rest. The visitor stopped at the edge of the mound. It pointed at it with one long-fingered hand. Just pointed. The gesture was so human that I almost laughed, except nothing about the situation was funny. It said, "Here, old one, sleep here. Bad sleep." I did not understand. I am still not sure I understand. But I think what it was telling me was that something was buried under the mound. Something old, something that was asleep, and the sleep was not entirely safe. The visitor was quiet for a long time after it said that. It stood at the edge of the mound with its head slightly lowered, and I had the impression, the very strong impression, that it was paying respects. Not in a religious way exactly, but in the way you stand at a grave when you visit a relative you never met but whose story you carry. There was a weight to its silence. It had been guarding this spot for a long time, and I do not think it had any positive feelings about what was under the dirt, but I do not think it had any hateful feelings either. It had a duty. The duty had a weight. The weight had been its for centuries, maybe. And now the duty was being handed off, and the weight was being handed off with it. It said, "Watcher stays, new watcher stays," or it wakes. I said, "I have to stay here." It said, "Family stays, cabin stays, watcher stays, same deal, long deal." I understood then what the cabin had been built for. My grandfather had built it in 1962 on a piece of inholding that he'd somehow secured inside what became federal wilderness. He had built it because his Ojibwe in-laws had told him to, because their grandfather's grandfather had made a deal that required somebody from the family to maintain a presence on this specific piece of land, in proximity to this specific mound, to keep the watchers fed and the watchers in place, because the watchers were the line between the thing in the mound and the world outside the woods. The cabin was not a vacation property. The cabin was a duty. The visitor looked at me. It said, "You stay," or "New family stays," or "One comes from us, cannot leave empty." I said, "How long?" It said, "Always." I stood there at the edge of the mound and I thought about my life. I thought about my wife back in Duluth. I thought about my job. I thought about my dad on the porch of the cabin. I thought about my grandfather, who had spent 30 years feeding this thing without ever telling his son the whole truth about why. I thought about my great-grandfather, and his father, and his grandfather, and the long line of people who had quietly maintained this duty for I don't know how many generations. I said, okay. I said it before I had really thought about it. I said it because there was no other answer. The visitor had told me what I needed to know. The deal was the deal. Either I kept it or somebody else did, or the watchers had to do it without us, and from what the visitor had said, they couldn't keep doing it forever. They were leaving. He was leaving. He was old. He was going down. The visitor nodded, the same precise dip of the head I'd thought I'd imagined before. Then it turned and it walked away from the mound and back into the trees, and within seconds I could not see it. It was just gone. I walked back to the cabin alone. The forest was alive again, the small night sounds returning, frogs and insects and the occasional far-off owl. The deep silence had lifted. Whatever had been pressing down on the woods had pulled back. My dad was on the porch when I got back. He was sitting in my grandfather's chair. He stood up when he saw me. We did not hug because we do not hug, but he put his hand on my shoulder and he squeezed it, and that was as much as either of us could do. I told him what the visitor had said. I told him about the mound. I told him about the deal. He sat down again. He looked at his hands in his lap. He said, "Cal, I wish I had known. I wish Pa had told me all of it. He gave me pieces. He told me about the visitor. He told me there was an arrangement. But he never told me about the mound. He never told me there was something under the ground that we were supposed to keep there." I said, "Maybe he didn't know." My dad said, "Maybe. Or maybe he didn't want to tell me because he wanted me to have a normal life. And then he died before he could decide whether to tell me when I was older." We sat on the porch until dawn. We did not talk much. My dad fell asleep in the chair around 5, and I sat next to him and watched the sun come up over the lake and thought about the rest of my life. That was 2 weeks ago. My dad and I came back home the next day. I have not been back to the cabin yet, but I'm going next weekend, with 20 pounds of beef trimmings from the butcher in 2 Harbors, and I am going to leave food at the edge of the clearing, the way my grandfather did, and the way I have been doing, except now I am going to do it understanding what it is for, and that changes everything about how I will do it. I do not know what is under the mound. I do not want to know. The visitor said it was old, and it called it a bad sleep, and that is the only language I have for it, and that language is good enough for me. Some things you do not need to know in detail. You just need to know they exist, and that the line that keeps them where they are has to be maintained, and that the maintaining of it has fallen to you. My wife knows now. I told her everything. I told her that we are not going to have kids, which we had already decided, but that I am going to talk to my brother's son, who is 22 and lives somewhere in Oregon, and who I haven't seen in years, and I am going to ask him if he wants to come up to the cabin sometime, because somebody has to know after me. Somebody from the family, somebody who can carry this when I'm gone the way my grandfather carried it, and my dad knew about it, and now I know about it. That's the only part of this that scares me. Not the visitor, not the mound, not the deal, the continuity. The fact that this thing has been going on for hundreds of years, and that it is now my job to make sure it keeps going for hundreds more, and that I am one man, and I am tired, and I do not know if I have what it takes to carry something that was carried by people whose names I don't even know. But I am going to try. Because the alternative, if I read the visitor right, is that the cabin gets sold to somebody who doesn't know, and the watchers leave or die, and whatever is in the mound wakes up. And I don't know what that means. But I know enough about the kinds of things that have been kept asleep for hundreds of years to know that I do not want to find out what happens when one of them stops being asleep. So I'm going up next weekend, and the weekend after that, and as many weekends as I can manage. And when I retire from the paving company, which I am going to do as early as I can swing it financially, I am going to move up there full time. I am going to be the watcher. I am going to feed the watchers who are left. And I am going to walk the property. And I am going to keep an eye on the mound. And I am going to live the rest of my life in the cabin my grandfather built for exactly this reason. I want to say one more thing before I'm done. My grandfather's glove is on the mantle in my living room in Duluth. I put it next to a picture of him. The picture is from 1986, taken at the cabin, him standing on the porch in his Carhartt jacket, his hands in his pockets, looking off toward the woodline. I always thought he was just looking at the trees. Now I know he was looking for the visitor. Probably he saw the visitor every time he was up there. Probably the visitor stood at the edge of the woods and watched him, and he watched it back, and they had a relationship of some kind that lasted decades, and he never told anybody about it. I wish I had known. I wish I had asked him. I wish I had been old enough when he was alive, to have had this conversation with him on the porch of the cabin, the way I would have wanted to ask him what the visitor's name was, to ask him what the song the visitor sang to him sounded like, to ask him whether he was scared, ever, or whether after 30 years he had stopped being scared and had just accepted that this was his life and his family's life, and that some duties get passed down without ever being explained. He's been gone since 1991. I can't ask him any of that, but I can carry it, and I can tell my brother's son when I find him, and I can hope that the line holds for one more generation, and one more after that, and however many we get before whatever is in the mound decides it has waited long enough. If you're driving through northern Minnesota sometime, and you take Highway 1 north out of Two Harbors, and you stop at the gas station in Finland for a sandwich and a six-pack, and you turn off onto an unmarked Forest Service road, and you drive 11 miles into the woods until you come to a small clearing with a cedar log cabin and a clearing mowed flat between the cabin and the wood line, do me a favor, keep driving, don't stop, don't get out. Don't look at the porch and think, that's a nice quiet spot. I wonder who lives there. That's my cabin. That's the cabin my grandfather built. That's the cabin I am going to die in someday, however many years from now, because that is the deal. And the deal goes back further than I do. And there is a song in the woods that has been sung for hundreds of years, and 4 notes that rise and fall, and a creature with yellow eyes that knows my name, and an old sleep under a mound of earth that has to keep sleeping. I am the watcher now. I did not ask for it. I do not know what I am doing, but I am going to do it anyway. Because somebody has to. And because the visitor, in his last visit, in his last word to me, looked at me with his tired yellow eyes and his ancient borrowed voice and said one more thing as he turned to leave. He said, "Thank you, Cal." It was the first time anybody had ever thanked me for taking a job. I don't know if I'll ever hear it again, but I'll carry it the whole rest of my life. I'll carry it.